"You have 30 days to vacate the premises," I said, sliding the notice across the polished oak desk. Richard Cole stared up at me, his eyes flickering between disbelief and a gathering storm of rage. The office hadn't changed much since the last time I stood here. Same leather chairs, same brass lamp, same smell of stale coffee and ambition. But everything else had. Just 2 years ago, I was the timid tenant sitting across from him as he tapped that same pen against a stack of unpaid invoices, lecturing me about how people like you never make it. Now, it was my signature on the deed, my name on every document that mattered. And as he read the eviction notice again, his lips moved soundlessly, searching for a way to reverse the inevitable. I leaned back and waited for him to understand that I wasn't bluffing. My name is Jessica Miller, and for most of my life, I believed Richard Cole when he told me I wasn't good enough. I was 28 the first time I met him, though I had known his reputation long before I ever set foot in his office. He was the kind of man who measured worth in property lines and dollar signs, the landlord of half the industrial park and 3 residential complexes in our town of Evanston, Illinois. Back then, I was nothing more than a line item in his ledger, a tenant scraping by, fighting to pay rent on a shabby apartment above the old pharmacy. My parents had died young, leaving behind a small inheritance that vanished faster than it should have. The rest of my life had been a study in holding it together with duct tape and hope. Even now, as I remember those years, I can feel the sting of humiliation in my chest. Every time I handed over a rent check, I saw the flicker of condescension in Richard's eyes. He'd tap his pen against the counter, look me over as if trying to figure out how much failure weighed, and say, "Jessica, you'd be better off moving back to whatever hole you crawled out of. You'll never make it on your own." But I stayed. I stayed because I'd promised myself I would never run again. My childhood had been a collage of faded photographs and packed boxes. My father, a mechanic, worked until his hands cracked and bled. My mother tried to stretch every dollar into a meal, a birthday cake, a little security. They believed in working hard, but they never had the luxury of stability. When they died in a car accident, I was 17 and alone. I finished high school living in a shelter, studying by the flickering light of a vending machine, telling myself there had to be something better. The first time I laid eyes on the building above the pharmacy, I knew it wasn't much. The stairs creaked. The pipes rattled like bones in the walls. But it was mine, well, sort of. I paid rent every month, dreaming about what it would be like to own something outright, to walk into a place and say, "This is mine," without worrying that someone could take it away. Richard Cole didn't care about my dreams. To him, I was just another tenant, another failing venture he could mock when he felt bored or generous. He owned the building and the business downstairs. Sometimes he dropped by unannounced, inspecting every corner of my apartment, tapping on the walls as if searching for hidden weaknesses. I think he enjoyed making me squirm. One evening, after he'd made another comment about how I'd be lucky to last the year, I went to see my grandmother, one of the few people who never treated me like I was disposable. She lived in a modest house on the other side of town, surrounded by hydrangeas she tended like children. Grandma Ruth was the kind of woman who'd survived the Depression with a spine of steel. She'd buried 2 husbands and outlived every person who tried to tell her she was worthless. When I sat on her porch steps and cried about Richard, she didn't pat my shoulder or murmur reassurances. She waited for me to finish, then said in her soft, steady voice, "Do you want to prove him right, Jessica?" I shook my head. "Then you'd better start thinking bigger than he ever imagined you could." I never forgot those words. In the months that followed, I worked 3 jobs. I cleaned offices before dawn, waitressed at the diner on Main Street, and managed inventory for a used bookstore that paid just enough to keep the lights on. I learned how to negotiate payment plans, how to swallow my pride when my debit card was declined, how to hide the exhaustion etched into my face. Through it all, Richard never let me forget who held the power. When the plumbing failed in my apartment, he sent plumbers who took weeks to show up. When the heat went out in January, he shrugged and told me to buy another blanket. When I begged for a few extra days to pay rent after my paycheck was delayed, he handed me a 3-day notice to vacate. It was during that winter that something in me changed. I realized I was done living like I owed the world an apology for existing. I was tired of begging for scraps of decency from a man who couldn't be bothered to see me as human. I started researching property law. I learned about foreclosures, about how banks sometimes bundled mortgages and sold them to investors willing to take a risk. I studied the public records on Richard's holdings. I started to notice the little cracks, unpaid liens, lawsuits he thought no one had noticed, debts he carried under shell companies. On my nights off, I'd sit cross-legged on the floor of my apartment with a legal pad and a stack of printouts. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as I highlighted phrases I didn't fully understand, determined to learn them anyway. People assume revenge comes in a single moment, a dramatic gesture, a final showdown. But the truth is, revenge is built in quiet hours when no one is watching. It's born from the decision to outlast the people who underestimate you. The day I found the foreclosure notice on Richard's commercial property, it felt like the universe was giving me a chance to step out from under his shadow. I didn't have the money to buy it outright, but I had something else: determination and an understanding of how desperate banks could be to get rid of a failing mortgage. Over the next 18 months, I negotiated, saved, borrowed, and bargained. I drained my savings. I cashed out the small life insurance policy my parents left me. I sold the rusted Honda I'd owned since college. Every dollar went towards securing the property Richard never thought anyone would dare to claim. When the final paperwork was signed, I sat in my car outside the county recorder's office, the deed trembling in my hands. I thought of Grandma Ruth, of the smell of her hydrangeas and the strength in her voice. I thought of Richard tapping his pen and telling me I'd never make it. I thought about how wrong he had been. But I didn't rush to tell him. I wanted to wait until I could look him in the eye and watch the understanding dawn. I wanted to savor the moment when he realized he had never broken me, that every cruelty, every insult, had only made me stronger. It was only fitting that he'd find out the day his own lease renewal came due. So when I walked into his office with the eviction notice in my hand, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was calm, because I knew I had earned every inch of that ground beneath my feet. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. Richard's hand was trembling as he set the eviction notice back on the desk. The silence stretched between us like a wire ready to snap. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing behind his starched collar. This is a mistake," he stammered, voice thin and scratchy. "You can't possibly have the authority to serve me with this. I own this building." I didn't flinch. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Every word, every pause, every lift of my chin. "Actually, Richard," I said, sliding a thick manila folder from my leather bag, "you might want to take a look at this before we continue." I opened the folder and laid out the papers one by one, deliberately slow so he had to watch every movement. The title deed, with my name printed in bold black letters. The purchase agreement, notarized 6 months ago. The foreclosure documents stamped and filed with the county clerk. The payment receipts, each one signed and dated, proof of every sacrifice I'd made to get here. He didn't even reach for them. He just sat there, pale and blinking, as if the documents might catch fire if he touched them. "I don't understand," he whispered, though I could see the edges of understanding dawning in his eyes, horrified and incredulous all at once. How did you even know this property was in trouble?" I could have told him about the late-night research, the records I'd combed through, the conversations I'd had with bank representatives who were all too eager to unload his debts. I could have told him about the hours spent studying contracts by the light of a single lamp, or the legal dictionaries with so many bookmarks they looked like they were sprouting feathers. But I didn't owe him that explanation. Instead, I rested my hand lightly on the deed and let a small, satisfied smile curve my lips. "It's amazing what you can learn when someone spends years underestimating you," I said. He closed his eyes, exhaling a shuddering breath. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked small. The man who had always loomed over me from behind his desk now seemed to shrink into the chair, his shoulders folding inward. You planned this, he said slowly, as though accusing me of some crime worse than all the things he'd done. You set me up. I tilted my head. I didn't set you up. You did that all by yourself when you decided you were untouchable. I leaned forward, my voice dropping so he'd have to strain to hear every word. All I did was pay attention. His eyes darted to the papers again. For a second, I thought he might lunge across the desk and tear them up like a child. Instead, he pressed both palms to his temples, trying to make sense of the new reality. One where I held all the leverage. One where the woman he'd mocked was now the owner of everything he thought defined his worth. You're bluffing, he tried again, though there was no conviction in his tone. This can't be legal. It's entirely legal, I replied, tapping my finger lightly on the county stamp. I suggest you consult your attorney if you'd like confirmation. Richard's gaze flickered up to mine, searching for any sign of weakness. He didn't find any. I'd spent too many years building a shell around my heart to be rattled by his disbelief. I'm not leaving, he said finally, voice low and defiant. I nodded once, calm as a winter morning. Then you'll be paying rent, at the current market rate. I slid another paper across the desk, the new lease agreement. And just so we're clear, the first payment is due by the 1st of next month. His mouth fell open. You're insane. Perhaps, I allowed. Or perhaps I'm just someone who refused to keep believing your story about what I was worth. He pushed back from the desk so abruptly the chair skidded across the floor. He paced to the window, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The office felt charged, electric like a summer storm about to break. I built this place, he muttered, staring out at the cracked parking lot. I built everything. You think you can just swoop in and take it all? I rose from my chair and stepped around the desk to stand beside him. Our reflections glimmered in the glass, me in my gray blazer, my posture steady, and him slumped, defeated. A perfect tableau of all the years he'd spent towering over me, now inverted. I didn't take it, I said quietly. I earned it. The same way you did, only without stepping on everyone I could. Richard turned, his face blotchy and drawn. You're nothing without this building. That almost made me laugh. It was the last desperate arrow he had to shoot. But I let the words settle before I answered. You never understood me, I said softly. This building isn't what makes me who I am. It's just proof I was never what you said. I gathered my papers and slipped them back into the folder. My pulse was steady, almost peaceful, because I realized in that moment that the revenge wasn't in owning the property. It was in knowing that, for the first time, Richard had to look at me and see the truth. You have a choice, I told him, turning toward the door. You can sign the lease and stay, or you can leave. Either way, I won't be living under your rules anymore. I paused on the threshold, hand resting on the worn brass handle. It's over, Richard, whether you want to accept it or not. He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, as though he'd been carved out of stone. For a long moment, I watched him, remembering every slight, every sneer, every time he'd told me I would fail. Then I walked out, the click of my heels echoing through the quiet hallway like a closing chapter. The sunlight hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. For the first time in years, the weight I'd been carrying seemed to lift from my shoulders. I took a slow breath, tasting the crisp autumn air, and felt something like gratitude bloom in my chest, not for Richard, but for every obstacle he'd thrown in my path. Without them, I might never have discovered how strong I really was. As I reached the curb, I looked back once, watching the curtains shift in his office window. I knew he was watching me go. I knew he was realizing that no amount of contempt could erase what I'd accomplished. It wasn't just revenge. It was freedom. And it was only the beginning. I didn't expect Richard to leave quietly. He was too proud, too convinced of his own superiority to let me walk away without a fight. The next morning, I found the first of many emails waiting in my inbox, thinly veiled threats dressed up as concerns. From Richard Cole. Subject: Urgent property ownership dispute. Jessica, there are several discrepancies in the paperwork you presented. I've forwarded everything to my legal team, and I'd advise you not to attempt to enforce any eviction or rent collection until this is resolved. Consider this a formal warning. Richard. I read it over breakfast, sipping my coffee slowly, as if it were any other morning. The words were so predictable I almost smiled. Richard would never accept that someone he considered beneath him had outmaneuvered him. He had to find a way to reassert control. I replied with a single sentence. All documents are in order. Please have your counsel contact mine directly. Then I turned off my phone and went to the office I now owned. The building was quiet when I arrived. The pharmacy on the ground floor had been closed since the foreclosure, its windows covered in brown paper. I unlocked the front door and walked through the echoing hallways, my heels clicking against the scuffed linoleum. It didn't look like much yet, but it was mine. By noon, Richard was standing in the doorway of the former pharmacy, arms folded tight across his chest. He wore a suit that looked expensive, but slightly too big for him, as if he'd lost weight overnight. His lawyer, a tall woman named Nancy Whitaker, hovered a step behind him, clutching a leather portfolio to her chest. Jessica, Richard began, voice cool, you've put yourself in a very precarious legal position. I raised an eyebrow. How so? Nancy stepped forward, her expression polite but steely. Mr. Cole has retained us to investigate potential procedural errors in the foreclosure process. If we find irregularities, we'll file for injunctive relief to block any further actions. I nodded, as if considering this carefully. You're welcome to pursue any avenue you feel necessary. But the bank has already certified the sale. The title is clear. I've consulted 3 attorneys to confirm it. Richard's jaw flexed. You think you're clever, don't you? No, I said softly. I think I'm prepared. His eyes narrowed. You think you've won. I don't need to think, I replied. I have. Nancy cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps we could all step inside and discuss this privately? I gestured toward the empty pharmacy. We gathered around the counter where I'd once stood, paying for cough syrup and aspirin when I could barely afford rent. Richard tried a new tactic. Jessica, I know we've had our differences. But you have to understand, this building is my legacy. My family built it from nothing. All the years I spent managing it, keeping it afloat during the recession, do you think that means nothing? For the first time, I let a hint of sorrow touch my voice. I know it means something to you, but you treated me like I was nothing. You made this personal long before I ever thought about buying the property. His face darkened. That's not fair. Business is business. No, I said quietly. You made it personal every time you told me I'd fail. Every time you let the heat go out in the middle of winter. Every time you laughed at my questions and called me the charity case upstairs. Nancy shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. She seemed to sense this was no longer just about legalities. Richard tried again, softening his tone. Look, maybe we can come to some arrangement. You could let me stay on as manager. I could teach you what you don't know about running a property like this. He was trying to sound magnanimous, but I heard the desperation in his voice. He was grasping for any scrap of power he could salvage. I appreciate the offer, I said, choosing my words carefully, but I don't need a manager who spent years convincing me I was worthless. His jaw tightened. You think you can do this on your own? You have no idea how complicated it is, tenants, maintenance, taxes. I'll figure out, I said simply. His eyes glittered with frustration. You're making a mistake. No, I replied. I'm correcting one. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then Nancy cleared her throat again. If you're unwilling to negotiate terms, we'll proceed with the injunction. You can try, I said, meeting Richard's gaze steadily. But you won't win. He looked away, as if the force of my certainty was too much. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I heard him say my name. Jessica. I paused, my hand on the handle. I never really thought you'd amount to anything, he said, voice raw. And now I don't know what that makes me. I looked back at him, and for a second, the anger faded. All I saw was a man who had built his identity on feeling superior to others. Without that, he was lost. It makes you human, I said quietly. Just like me. Nancy glanced at him, her expression softening, and for a moment, I thought he might finally understand. But the flicker of recognition in his eyes was quickly buried beneath resentment. I stepped into the hallway, breathing out the tension that had been coiled in my chest since the day I signed the deed. As I locked the door behind me, I heard Nancy speaking in low tones, trying to console him. I didn't stay to listen. Outside, the late afternoon sun was warm on my face. I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the first deep breath after a long illness. Later that evening, I received a call from Lisa Bennett, a former tenant who'd lived across the hall from me. She'd always been polite, but wary of drawing Richard's attention. I heard what happened, she said. Is it true? You really own the building now. It's true, I told her. There was a long pause. I just wanted to say good for you, Jessica. You deserve it. Her words touched something tender inside me. Thank you. I'm thinking about reopening the flower shop, she added hesitantly. Now that, he won't be breathing down my neck. I'd love that, I said, smiling. Let me know if you need help with the lease. After we hung up, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. For the first time, the building felt like home. Not because I'd taken it from Richard, but because I'd earned it, every inch, every brick. The next morning, I returned to the office to find Richard waiting on the steps, holding the unsigned lease agreement. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his voice was steady. I'll pay the rent, he said quietly. I don't have much choice. I nodded. Thank you. As he handed me the papers, his fingers brushed mine. For a moment, we looked at each other, and I thought I saw something like respect in his eyes. But it didn't matter. I hadn't done this to earn his approval. I'd done it to reclaim my own story. When he turned and walked away, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Only the clean, quiet certainty that I would never again let anyone define my worth. And that was enough. The first Monday after Richard agreed to pay rent, I arrived at the building early, before the sun crested over the rooftops. The sky was pale and streaked with lavender, and the street was so still it felt as if the world were holding its breath. I let myself in with the new set of keys, a small, unremarkable ring of brass and steel that nevertheless felt like a coronation. Every door I unlocked, every room I entered, was another quiet declaration. This is mine. I walked the halls slowly, stopping to study the scuffed floors and cracked baseboards, the places I'd once tiptoed past as if I had no right to be here. I thought about all the times Richard's voice had echoed through these spaces, reminding me how insignificant I was. And I realized I felt no urge to erase that memory. I didn't want to pretend it had never happened. I wanted to keep it as a reminder of how far I'd come. At mid-morning, I called Lisa Bennett and invited her to meet me in the old pharmacy unit. She arrived a half hour later, carrying a cardboard box filled with color swatches and lease documents. She looked different, lighter, somehow, like she'd set down a burden she'd carried for years. Hi, she said, smiling as she stepped inside. I can't believe how much brighter it looks in here without the paper over the windows. I know, I said. It's amazing what a little light can do. We sat on the floor together, our backs against the counter, as she laid out her plans. A new flower shop, sunflowers and peonies and climbing ivy in the front windows, a workbench in the back for arranging bouquets. She'd even chosen a name, Second Bloom. It feels right, she said a little shyly, like it's finally time to start over. I reached over and squeezed her hand. It is. We went over the lease line by line, and when she signed it, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, for giving me a chance. I shook my head. You earned this, just like I did. After she left, I sat alone in the middle of the empty space. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the echoes, so many memories layered into these walls, some painful, some beautiful. I realized that owning this building wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about creating something better in the place where I'd once been made to feel small. A few days later, Richard returned to sign his lease. He arrived just after lunch, wearing a suit that hung loose on his frame. He looked older than I remembered. He didn't speak as I led him to the office where we'd first faced off. The silence between us felt heavy but clean, stripped of the posturing and contempt that had defined our relationship for so long. He picked up the pen, studied the lease for a long moment, and signed it without comment. When he set the pen down, he looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Acceptance. "Jessica," he said quietly, "I don't know what you want me to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "We're done fighting." He hesitated. "I suppose we are." He stood, his shoulders sloping as if the years had finally settled on his back. "I never thought it would end like this." "I did," I said, though my voice was gentle. "I've thought about this day for a long time." He nodded once, then turned to go. At the doorway, he paused. "I'm sorry," he said without looking back, "for the way I treated you." I didn't rush to fill the silence. For a long time, I'd imagined what it would feel like to hear those words. I'd thought they would taste like victory. But standing there in that quiet room, I realized they felt more like a release, like putting down something too heavy to carry any longer. "Thank you," I said finally. He left without another word. I stood alone in the office, watching the door swing slowly shut. And I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph, but peace. That evening, I walked to the little diner where I'd worked my second job for 3 years. I hadn't been back in months, not since the day I signed the deed. The place hadn't changed. Same vinyl booths, same cracked linoleum, same smell of coffee and fried onions. Maria, the owner, greeted me with a hug that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. "I heard the news," she said, beaming. "I always knew you'd make it." I laughed, feeling something tight in my chest finally loosen. "I wasn't so sure." She poured me a cup of coffee, and we sat together at the counter. As we talked, I felt the last of my old fear fade. Because I knew now that I'd survived the worst, and I'd built something stronger in its place. A week later, I hosted a small gathering in the old pharmacy space. Lisa brought fresh flowers in mason jars. Maria brought a tray of lemon bars. A handful of former tenants came to see the building in transition, to celebrate something none of us had thought possible. As the sun set, I stood in the doorway and watched the light slant across the worn floorboards. The laughter and conversation drifted around me, warm as a summer evening. Richard didn't come, but that was all right. This wasn't his story anymore. Near the end of the night, Lisa found me by the counter. "Have you thought about what you're going to do next?" she asked. I looked around the room, at the fresh paint on the walls, at the people who'd once shared my struggle, at the quiet pride in their faces. "I think I'm going to make this place into something good," I said. "Something that helps people remember they're worth more than what someone else tells them." She smiled. "You're already doing that." I thought of my grandmother, of her hydrangeas, her soft voice, her unwavering belief in me. And I knew that everything I'd built, everything I was still building, was part of her legacy, too. That night, as I locked up and stepped into the cool darkness, I felt the kind of calm that only comes when you've finally chosen grace over vengeance. Owning the building wasn't about punishing Richard. It was about reclaiming the story of who I was and what I could be. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I would never again let anyone tell me I wasn't enough. 3 months later, the building no longer looked like the place where I'd once felt so small. Fresh paint covered the cracked walls, pale blue and soft cream replacing the tired beige. New lights glowed in the hallways. The old pharmacy had been transformed into Lisa's shop, Second Bloom, and on any given morning, the air smelled of roses, lavender, and the faint, comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting up from the new cafe a tenant opened beside her. The first time I stepped through the front door after the renovations were finished, I felt something ease inside me, a quiet certainty that this building wasn't a monument to revenge anymore. It was a testament to renewal. The sun poured through the windows, glinting off polished counters and displays of handmade candles and tiny succulents. I walked slowly past each section, breathing in the peace that had replaced the stale air Richard once carried with him like a shadow. Near the back, Lisa was trimming the leaves from a cluster of hydrangeas. She looked up and grinned. "You're early. I wanted to see how everything looks before the open house." She gestured around the shop. "What do you think?" I looked at the bright walls, the buckets of fresh blooms, the hand-painted sign she'd hung in the window. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. And it was. Outside, a banner fluttered in the breeze. "Community Appreciation Day. Come see what's new." Over the past few weeks, word had spread that the building had changed hands. At first, people were skeptical. Richard had been such a fixture, someone everyone knew, even if they didn't trust him. But once they saw the repairs happening, the new businesses opening, and the respectful way I treated tenants, curiosity replaced doubt. By noon, the sidewalks were crowded. Neighbors lingered by the cafe patio tables, sipping lattes and sampling scones. Parents brought their kids to pick out little pots of daisies. An elderly couple paused in the doorway, holding hands as they studied the bouquets. I moved among them quietly, answering questions, accepting hugs and congratulations. At some point, Maria from the diner pressed a paper bag into my hands, still warm. "Lemon bars," she said with a wink. "For luck." I hugged her. "Thank you." "Thank you," she corrected me, her voice thick. "You gave us all a reason to believe things could change." It struck me then that my journey had never just been about proving Richard wrong. It had always been about proving to myself, and everyone who felt unseen, that we could choose to build something different. Just after 2 o'clock, I slipped away from the crowd and climbed the stairs to what had once been my apartment. The hallway looked brighter now, freshly painted and lined with framed photos of local landmarks. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Sunlight streamed across the hardwood floors. The little living room still held the shape of all those evenings I'd sat cross-legged with my legal pads and highlighters, determined to learn enough to change my life. I set the paper bag on the counter and stood there a moment, feeling the hush of memory settle around me. Then I unpacked the lemon bars onto a plate, poured a glass of water, and sat by the window. Outside, the street was alive with a quiet celebration of ordinary people claiming something better for themselves. After a while, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, worn photograph I kept with me. My grandmother Ruth, smiling in her garden, a spray of hydrangeas in her arms. I propped it against the window frame and traced my fingertip across the edge. "I did it," I whispered. The wind caught the banner outside, making it snap and flutter. For a second, I could almost hear her voice again, calm, steady, unshakable. "Think bigger than he ever imagined you could." I smiled and closed my eyes. I didn't know exactly what would come next. There would be challenges. There would be moments of fear and doubt. But I also knew that whatever came, I was ready. Because I wasn't just the girl who'd been told she'd never make it. I was the woman who'd taken back her story and turned it into something that could nourish everyone around her. 2 months after the open house, I hosted a community event in the courtyard behind the building. Folding tables held trays of food from local restaurants. Lanterns swayed overhead in the warm evening breeze. Children chased each other between potted plants while their parents talked and laughed and dreamed out loud. Richard came, too. I'd invited him out of something I couldn't quite name. Mercy, maybe, or the hope that we could both move forward. He stood near the edge of the courtyard, hands in his pockets, looking older but somehow softer. When our eyes met, he gave me a tentative nod. I returned it, feeling no bitterness. Later, as the evening wound down, he approached me. "This is something," he said, glancing around. "It is," I agreed. "I won't pretend I understand it all," he said after a moment. "But I can see you've made something good here." "That was always the point," I said gently. He looked at me, his gaze steady. "I'm sorry for the things I said. The things I did." "I know," I said. "And I meant it." We stood there for a moment in quiet understanding, two people who had finally put down their weapons. As the crowd began to thin, Lisa brought me a bouquet wrapped in brown paper, hydrangeas, just like my grandmother's. "For your office," she said, smiling. Thank you. When I locked up that night, I paused on the front steps. The windows glowed warm behind me. The street was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. I thought about everything it had taken to reach this place. The long nights, the doubt, the fear, the relentless determination. And I knew this was only the beginning. I would keep building, keep growing, keep proving to myself that my worth wasn't defined by anyone else's smallness. I looked up at the stars just starting to bloom across the sky. Then I turned the key in the lock, feeling a peace I had never known before. Tomorrow, there would be work to do, leases to sign, repairs to schedule, new ideas to plant. But tonight, there was only this moment. The quiet, golden certainty that I had finally come home to myself.